I hope everybody is doing well. We're back here at the Sormena project with another technical tutorial. And this week we're going to be talking about creating custom sweeps. This is part 1 of 2. We're going to be using one method in this tutorial where we use a block of noise to ultimately craft our sweep. And then next week we'll be using a different method, and it will ultimately have a similar effect, but will sound quite different, and the approach is a little bit different. Normally in these tutorials, we focus almost entirely on the technical how, and then I leave it up to you to figure out why you might want to do this and where it's going to be applicable in your own music. In this tutorial, we need to spend a couple of minutes talking about the why, because the how is so simple, and so you might almost overlook the why. And I think in this case, with these sweeps where there's so many pre-made, ready-to-go samples, you really do have to ask, why would I want to make it from scratch? And is it appropriate for me to be making it from scratch, or can I get away with, does using one of these pre-built, pre-ready, pre-made samples do the trick? And I'm not telling you that you have to work from scratch every single time. You absolutely don't have to do that, but there are some reasons why actually doing it from scratch may make more sense, may help your track. So we'll also have to try to define what the sweep is, a very difficult thing to do, and we then will eventually discuss how you can easily craft unique sweeps for a specific project. And that's kind of the kicker to this whole thing, is how can we make these sweeps either relate or not relate to a song that we're working on. This is all about doing it in context. I'm a huge believer in, like, when you're making a song, to actually sit there and make the parts for it right then and there. I get that there's an advantage sometimes to going off and creating presets or making, pre-made sweeps that you could come back to later on, but you always run into, well, does this actually serve the project I'm working on? So we're talking about making these for a specific project within a specific project, and that's really where making the custom sweep has some advantages that we'll talk about. Like always, the techniques shown can be applied in any DAW, in this case with a variety of instruments and samples, either free samples or paid samples. Noise. It's a word that conjures up all sorts of different feelings, and it's also a word that's been defined in many different ways. We're not trying to come up with a definition that's going to be universal. But what we are going to do is talk about noise in the context of this tutorial, in how do I get my block of noise? That's what we're talking about here, so don't quote me on anything that you hear on this slide as being some kind of universal definition for noise, because it certainly varies drastically from dictionary to dictionary and even just from person to person. So for our purpose, noise is typically going to be a sound that lacks a definite pitch or some kind of defining characteristic. So, for example, a snare usually lacks definite pitch, but we know it's a snare just based on the timbre and based on that amplitude envelope, that really quick percussive sound, and then it normally fades relatively quickly. So that really wouldn't work as a definition for noise, at least not in what we're talking about here. We're also talking about a sound that's relatively full frequency, so just meaning that there's signal from low to high, and we will look at this in spectrum analyzers as we move on, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But really, I just want you to understand that many sounds can be classified and used as blocks of noise, which we'll be talking about and working with in the tutorial. Therefore, there's no reason to get too bogged down with definitions, and I would say that's true for almost any sort of creative application. Their definitions are there, and they really exist more as guidelines than they do as hard and fast rules. It's about taking those definitions and figuring out how to work within them or even go beyond them. What is the sweep? A great question. Historically, we tend to think of white noise sweeps. So the word sweep is usually paired with white noise. But really, in the modern day and with all of the variations of music that are being made, sweeps really do imply a lot more. And we're going to be using the word sweep in really a way so far beyond just the basic white noise sweep. So some synonymous terms include things like risers and fallers, and those normally denote a pitch element, so a pitch rising, a pitch falling. But they also count as sweeps because that motion is really what I think the word sweep is all about. It's that sweeping up motion, that sweeping down motion, whether that's with a cutoff frequency, with pitch, with all sorts of different things. That really is what kind of defines the sweep. And generally, these all then fall into the same category, which is what we're going to call transition effects. This is where you see these used to help with transitions. And in the next slide, we'll go into more detail on that. If you're trying to listen for examples of sweeps, well, you've heard them all the time. And mostly they're found in genres of music that use electronic elements. So you wouldn't, in a classical piece, hear some kind of crazy synthesized white noise sweep. However, composers, even from way back in the day, and this is especially true in opera, have tried to use the orchestra as a way of creating these sort of sweeps, these tension-building moments, which then release in some way. So if there was some instrument in the orchestra that was capable of doing what the white noise sweep or what just the general sweep does for our modern types of music that use electronic elements, you better believe that they would have used it because it's a great device for building tension. And this is why you find it in all sorts of EDM, in pop music, to a lesser degree in hip hop, because there are other sort of special effects that we can use if we're crafting beats. But really, even in any sort of genre of music that has some sort of hybridized form with electronic instruments. So it could be some sort of progressive rock where you have both synthesizers and, acoustic instruments. You will then normally see some kind of sweep being used as a tension element building up for some kind of transition. And speaking of transitions, we'll start by defining transitions in a very broad and loose sense, which is just going from one section of music to another. So from the verse into the chorus, from the chorus into the bridge, whatever the case may be. But with these more loop-based genres of music, we also have transitions when the loop is repeating. So if you have an 8-bar loop of something and it's going to repeat 4 or 5 times, it's that moment before the loop starts up again that constitutes the transition. And normally there will be something that builds into the start of the loop. So you can imagine that you have 16 bars of music, and in the very first bar of music you have a crash cymbal, so that's denoting start of the track, here we go, we're underway. And then at the start of the 17th bar, so after 16 bars of music, there's another crash cymbal, which is denoting that we're moving somewhere. Well, to get from that first crash to this second crash after this 16 bars of music, there has to be some kind of a transition, or there normally is a transition, and this is where the sweep effects come into play, along with many other devices. This is just one of many transition devices that you can use. This is just a very obvious and easy one. And so to make this transition either smoother, rougher, more abrupt, playing with expectation for the listener, we'll then go and use sweeps as one of these devices. And this really, like most music, is all about tension and resolution, what then later became known in more of the dubstep days as the build and the drop. Same way of saying tension and resolution, and even in a more broader sense, just expectation and reality. How are we going to play off what the listener is expecting? We all are familiar with that sweep noise, and most of us expect when that sweep gets to its top, when that motion finishes, that something is going to happen. Is that something going to be more energy? Is it going to be less energy? That's entirely up to you. So as I wrote here in this last little bullet, the sweep can play into that in a variety of ways, into the tension and resolution. Does the drop actually happen after a building sweep, or do you do some sort of false drop or false cadence and you build up again? These are the sort of questions that you have to ask when you're making your track. And again, why we can, and in some cases should, go with the custom approach of building sweeps so that they fit our arrangement and fit the song that we're working on at the time. A few more thoughts about working from scratch. Using pre-made sweeps and transition effects is absolutely fine. I am not one of those people who's going to tell you you have to work from scratch, because I know that just doesn't work for everybody, and it just wouldn't make sense in every single situation that you might find yourself in. What we want here at the Sormena project is just to make you aware that you can do it from scratch. You don't have to go out and buy that extra sample pack if you can't afford it. If you can afford it and it gets what you want, by all means, buy it and use it. I'm not telling you not to do that. But one added benefit of working from scratch is that you can actually add an element of cohesion with the rest of the track because you're thinking about this sweep in relation to what you're actually working on. And that's not always true with samples. So it can either work as something similar, something that blends, or even as something a little bit more dissonant, if that's the right word, something that feels almost contrasting to everything else that's happening. And it's all up to you as the producer to figure out what effect do you want to get. And so working from scratch normally gets you there quicker than having to go through and listen to 500 different samples trying to get the thing that you're imagining. If you can imagine it, hopefully by the end of this tutorial, you'll have a better idea of how to create it, and then, it will work well in the track. So in what's becoming more of an automated world, and here, I'm getting up on my soapbox, one other thing about working from scratch is that you really can take pride in knowing that you've done it yourself. Even if it doesn't work out the way that you intended or that you wanted. It's fine to try working from scratch, absolutely hate the results you get, and go and use a sample. But it's about that experience. It's about getting better. You have to be willing to put yourself out there. You have to be willing to try and not get what you want so that one day you eventually will, and it will become almost like second nature, instinctual. And this then comes down to this debate that doesn't get talked about a lot in music production, but probably should, which is effort and results. You can put in a lot of effort, work from scratch, and make a track that really you hate at the end of the day. Or you could put in very little effort, use a lot of these pre-made samples, and get a great result. It's just really a question for yourself. What do you want to do? What do you eventually want to become? Because eventually doing the little effort but getting a good result, while it's satisfying in the moment, it doesn't really work long term, especially as genres change and you eventually are spending a lot of money on having to get a lot of these different samples to use. And, if you can do it from scratch, you can take pride in that, but you're also going to have more fail days, basically, when you're working without anything else, when you have the blank canvas. So just a question to ask yourself, not something you have to worry about too much, but again, I just wanted to briefly bring that up here. Okay, so we're finally into actually making our sweep effects or our transition effects. And we're going to begin with step 1 of 2. And this first step is the block of marble itself. So we'll use synthesizers or other free samples. It can be a lot of different sounds to get that initial block of noise, which we are then going to use as the basis for eventually making that sweep. So there are a ton of different options here. Be creative, brainstorm on your own. For example, some natural things like waterfalls, or wind, a really gusty windstorm, leaves rustling around. All of those things can actually be used as blocks of noise for creating sweeps, as well as the more traditional noise elements that are built into a lot of your virtual synthesizers. So if you want, you can take this a step further and you can actually blend in waveforms, especially if you're going with a synthesizer. And what you would normally do if you are going to add some kind of pitched waveform is to make sure that that pitch is either the tonic, the dominant, or the leading tone of whatever key your song is in. So if you're in C major, you can have it always sort of bringing you back to knowing that, okay, the home key is in C, so I'm going to make sure that my pitch is C, that I'm blending in with my noise. If you know that you're building to C, you're building to resolution, so the chord before that is on the dominant, you could have that be the G, or the leading tone, what leads back to C, which is the B. So B to C, that half step is really what signifies that final resolution. If you don't, or you don't want to use a waveform or a classic oscillator, you can also actually use EQ or resonator banks as a way to suggest pitch, and we will be looking at that in the example which it seems confusing on that bullet, but it's actually quite easy to accomplish, just 1 or 2 steps. If working in a synth, find a few parameters, interesting parameters, use the effects, and automate those a little bit if you want some additional variation and something interesting happening even in that basic block of noise. You're going to do a lot more later on, but you can already start to imply certain things. You can start to imply that sweep from the very beginning by taking some effects within the synthesizer and automating them, normally with some kind of drastic move happening towards the very end, thus classifying it as a sweep. We're kicking things off inside of Audacity because Audacity gives us a great free noise generator tool. You can go on the internet and you can search like white noise generator, and you'll find a bunch of different websites that claim that they'll allow you to, export clean white noise or clean pink noise. But the more you look at these websites, the more they try to like tie your hands and say that you have to credit them, or you have to sign up, or you have to pay money, or they limit the amount of time that you can export, or the quality. And all of that stuff is really ridiculous when you think about how simple a noise generator really is. And luckily, inside of Audacity, which is a free program on both Windows and also on Mac, we get this great noise generator, and really we're not limited in any way. We can get the quality we want, we can get the length we want, we can bring that sample into our DAW and then eventually tweak it to get that sweep effect that we're going for. So we're going to kick things off inside of Audacity. I'm just going to very quickly create 3 different tracks here, and we're going to go to the noise generator. You can generate some other things in here, definitely fun, worth experimenting with, but all we need now is noise. And we're going to start by going to white noise. We'll go ahead and just make 15 seconds, and this amplitude is just setting how loud it's going to be here inside of the program, so that's fine. Let's go down to the next guy. Let's generate some pink noise. And then in this last example, we're going to generate brown noise. So I'm not going to go into the technical distinctions, how this noise is being generated, what it is technically defined as. You can go onto the internet and search that yourself. For our purposes, what's really important is that we just listen and hear the differences. So I have these 3 different noise brought up, and you can actually tell just from looking at this that there's more complexity here at the top, and as we go down, less and less complex. And what this is also telling me is that we can expect this to be the brightest, this to be somewhere in the middle, and this to be relatively the darkest. So let's start with the first one and just take a listen to it. This is the white noise. All right, that's quite enough of that. We can then go in and listen to the pink noise. Much smoother, as you can tell, and then we can also listen to the brown noise. So certainly the darkest of the 3, especially if you're listening on a full frequency playback system, you can really hear with that brown noise how it's very low. You can actually hear the sub frequencies in that. And so you might be thinking, well, this brown noise sounds the least harsh to my ear. It's the most pleasing. I should probably use that as the starting point for my sweep. And you absolutely could. However, you are limiting yourself because there's not additional upper frequencies to sweep into. We are planning to use a filter in the second part here. So it is okay to go and export the pure white noise. Even though it sounds so harsh and so annoying to you just on initial listen, you are going to be tuning it back, toning it back. So there might only be a brief second when you hear all of this in its glory. Now, if you want to go and you want to export this, it's very simple in this program. We have our white noise here. I'm just going to go up and I'm going to choose export. And this is where we get then our options and our settings. So I can just call this something like white noise, Audacity. And then we can choose how we want to export this. 16-bit wave is fine. If you want higher quality, you can go in here to other uncompressed files and then choose your options like so. So you can use the higher bit 24 if you want. And you could even go and choose this to AIFF if you prefer that instead. But I am more than happy with using the preset in here. The 16-bit wave file would work for me. I can go ahead, click save. Okay. It's gone and it's exported that. It's going to be on the desktop, and we can then go and bring it into our DAW. Now that we're in the DAW, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the technical nature of what we refer to as noise. But as time goes on, we want to get further and further away from that and really just focus on that block of sound that we're going to use to eventually craft our sweep. That's the point of this part 1 of part 2, getting the block of noise, and then in part 2, crafting that noise. So we're going to make a few observations here, and then as time goes on, we're really just going to be thinking more in terms of how can I make this sound cool? That's really the point here. So with white noise, what I want you to do is I want you to notice where this is peaking out on the meter. Okay, in and around the -5 range. Now let's take a look at the pink noise and see where that's peaking out in the meter. -2.5. So this -5, pink noise -2.5. But which sounds louder? Well, to me, the white noise absolutely sounds louder. However, it's peaking out 2.5 dB lower. So what's the cause and what's the reason for that? And to get to the bottom of this, we do have to do a little bit of technical definition, but also we can use the span plugin to help us out. So let's take a look here at this white noise. Very interesting what we see here. Okay, and I'm going to come back to this in a second. Notice how this is sloping up. And then let's look at the pink noise. And now the pink noise seems to be a little bit straighter across. And all of you with a little bit more technical knowledge here are suddenly jumping up and down going, no, this can't be. This is counterintuitive to the definition. And it is. And the reason for that is this plugin itself, this spectrum, is attempting to emulate and show, at least in these settings, what we are perceiving. Remember that what we perceive, how we hear, is not linear. Think back to those equal loudness curves. And also look at the scaling here. So 1,000 frequencies, so from 0 to 1,000 hertz. Let's imagine that's what we're looking at. How much space is that occupying here on this scale? It's going from here all the way to here. Okay, well, the equivalent then of this 1,000 frequency, you would expect that this would be a really, really long and super wide display, but it's not. It has to be compressed. We hear all the way up to 20K, and from 1K to 2K, which is the same technical distance as from 0 to 1K, you can see how much little space that it's occupying relative. And that's really important to understanding how this graph is working and what you're actually hearing. So to get from 20 hertz up to 10K or 10,000 hertz, we take up this much space. But to go from 10K to 20K, the next 10,000 hertz, it occupies such a smaller amount. And that's really just to make this somewhat manageable to look at. But it's also why things are kind of thrown out of whack. So what we're actually looking at is sort of what we're perceiving, what we're hearing. But if we want to get technical with it, which we can, which is useful, we can go in here to the edit mode and change this slope and bring it back to 0. Okay, so now what we're going to be looking at is what's really going on. So with the white noise now, what we're actually seeing is equal energy across the entire frequency spectrum. So from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. But just remember that there's a lot more happening here in this upper range than what's happening in this lower range. And then if we go and we look at the pink noise, which is a little bit more perceptual, pink noise is supposed to at least sound to our ears as though we're getting even amounts of frequencies across the board. That's what it's supposed to sound like versus what it actually sounds like, which is incredibly bright. And that would be the white noise. So white noise is technical. Pink noise is a little bit more perceptive. So playing with our hearing mechanism, how our brain actually interprets all of these frequencies. And this is then why the slope would have to look like this, right? Because there are so many more frequencies up here, they have to be quieter in order to balance out across the board. What does this really mean to us? Well, if we go back and look at the white noise, what this is telling us is that there's no definite pitch. And the reason it's saying there's no definite pitch is that we're not seeing any spikes here. And the spikes are what indicate the actual pitches, the fundamental. So if we go and we take this span and we copy the device and we bring it on here at the end of this piano, and we go and we play a couple of notes on the piano, You can now see just how much different this looks. And this is indicating to us, oh, okay, here's the fundamental. This is a C. And then we can trace this up the harmonic series. So we have a C, we have another C an octave above that. It then should go to the G, which is the fifth, and so forth. And this is just tracing what a piano would end up sounding like. So when you strike that string, the vibrating pattern, whatever. And this is useful to us because we can still, if we want, emulate some kind of pitch or make a pitch, just in the back of our head with our white noise, with these default noise generator sounds. And the way we do that is actually with EQ or with resonator banks. So this is now the pink, this is now the white. And so you're wondering, okay, well, how do you really go about doing that? And the answer is, if you take an EQ, like an EQ5, for example, and we'll just use 2 of these for now. And we can imagine that we're trying to emphasize the pitch A. Let's say that we're in the key of A minor, and we want to really emphasize that this noise is still somehow related to what we're doing. We can go in here and we can choose the hertz that correspond to A, and we know A4, 440, A3, 220, A1, 110, etc. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to choose 110 here. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to choose 220. Some EQs will actually give you a little display. Like you can see, this is telling us, okay, this corresponds to A3. And we can go in here at 440. And then that would correspond to A4. And you can try to move it around and get it, but it's usually easier to just type this in. So what we can do in real time here is try to emphasize these particular frequencies and see what it does to our display. So again, your ears are probably going to get worn out pretty quickly from listening to this white noise, but that's okay for the sake of example. Let's just go and turn this down even further. The problem right now is that this is way too broad. It needs to be very, very steep with the resonance, and that's what the resonator bank is doing. So And so we're creating almost this little harmonic series blending in here with the white noise. Something like that. And while you're listening back to it in real time, you're probably not thinking this is making that much of a difference, but listen to what happens when we take it out and bring it in. And you could do the exact same thing with your pink noise. And if we want to make this even a little bit more stark and a little more whistly, we just kind of do the inverse here and we bring more gain in on this guy and bring some gain back here. And you can really just set these things up to taste. And then this would definitely be something that you could work with that is related back to A, but still for, the average listener in the track, you're just going to be hearing it as white noise. And you can do the exact same thing with the pink noise as well. If you're lucky, you may also have a resonator bank, which will allow you to set this up a little bit quicker and really emphasize things even a bit more. So I can turn off this EQ, but we can do the same sort of thing and just go in here and choose like 440, 880, and 1.6K. And then we'll turn off all these other guys. We'll bring the mix down, bring all the volumes down, and we'll listen to what happens as we bring in these different frequencies here. So this is a very powerful technique if you have a resonator bank, but remember, you can also just do it with an EQ as well. So that is a way to take those basic generated noise samples that you have, and you can then, still emphasize pitch in one way or another. One thing you probably noticed in that last little section was me botching basic addition. And to avoid that, you can always use one of these frequency to pitch charts like you see here. It's a fantastic resource, and we have A4 going to 440 equal tempered. So this is basically what all of your instruments are working with inside of the DAW, unless you're going in and changing things, which I don't really highly recommend unless you know what you're doing. So of course, if you want, you could go and then find, okay, if I actually want to know what A6 was and I wanted to add 880 instead of 800, I could have gone in here and seen, oh, okay, that equals 1,760, and I could have typed that into my EQ. But keep in mind that you don't have to just stick to working with the tonic of whatever key you're in. You could also work with the dominant, the subdominant, the leading tone. You could create chords. That's part of the beauty of the resonator bank, is that you can very easily kind of emphasize a particular chord, and while still keeping, I should say, a little bit of that unbalance that you get with the white noise. So let's jump back into the DAW with that out of the way and talk about length a little bit. One thing that you have to decide, and this normally happens after a lot of the parts are already in and you're going and you're making your sweeps, is how long do I need the sweep to be? So when you're working with samples, the one thing that's an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time is it all comes down to the length that you set. So if I just needed something to be 1 bar, I could keep this in raw mode here, which is just the audio file, and I could very easily close it down to just be 1 bar. And I could make my sweep based off of that. But let's say that instead I want it to be, 16 bars. Well, there's a little bit of a problem here if I stick to raw mode, and that's that I can't stretch this out. But you can take advantage of your DAW's stretching algorithms. Sometimes they'll give you weird artifacts and like a feedback or a distortion, but that can be very useful for these sweep effects. That can actually work to your advantage. So if I want, I can go in here and I can put this into a stretch mode. And if I want this to be perfect, I can bring this back to 110, so it will sound no different. And then going into the actual stretch, I could pull this out. And if I want to go really extreme, I could pull it all the way here, and you'll start to hear some of these artifacts that come in. And then I'm almost just going here and trying to set to taste what artifact do I like the most. But this would be the way to do it. And of course, this is a very, very long sweep, but this would be one way that you could actually go and you could set it up. The other big advantage to actually going into your pitch stretching algorithm, whatever DAW you're working in, is that you then have control over pitch. And obviously, this can also come into advantage when we start to make our sweeps, and we might use pitch then to be a sweeping effect, so to sweep up or to sweep down. When you're making your blocks, signal flow does play a pretty big role, because if I was going to use this as the basis for my sweep, and I go in here and I'm adjusting and changing pitch, what's the problem with that? And the answer is actually pretty obvious. As this is playing back and I'm changing the pitch, you hear a difference, but the thing that's remaining constant is the resonator bank. And that is because the resonator bank is happening post the pitch change here. So if I was going to use this as my 8-bar block for my sweep, what I would actually have to do is I would have to go out here and I would have to bounce this. And then by bouncing this onto a track that doesn't have any effects, it's taken advantage of. It's brought that resonator bank over. And now if I go in here and I start manipulating the pitch, we'll hear that the resonator bank moves along with it. So we just have it come in here like, oops, sorry, that's pan. Did it twice in a row. You can hear how that resonator bank effect is now actually moving in time, and that's because we've bounced it out. If I was to apply a similar curve in here, it's making such a small and insignificant difference. So do be aware of signal flow. Understand that bouncing is oftentimes your friend when you're making these blocks, so that when you do get in and you start making those additional changes, if something is happening onto that block of white noise from the beginning, you want to make sure that it's going to also move along and correspond with changes that you make after the fact. When you're working in what I would call more standard genres of music where the expectation is very high, for example, beatport style EDM or pop music, you're probably going to be working with default chunks or blocks of white noise or pink noise because that's what the listener expects. That's what's typically used. But if you're a bit more experimental or you're more in line with being kind of a unique artist as compared to a default producer, then by all means, it's worth experimenting with what you plan to use as your block for your sweep. For example, and I'm going to link to where these samples come from, like a freaking treasure trove of free samples for music producers and artists. We can use things like waterfalls. And you can see here, no definite pitch. This is definitely going to work. And once we start to add more effects, it's going to be a lot of fun. And we could even just go in here again and say, okay, I need to get, 4 bars of this or whatever. We just chop out the 4 bars we want and we can work with it. And if we want to get experimental, again, very easy to go in there, consolidate this guy, put it into a stretch mode, go in here at 110. Get experimental with it. We could go in here, add an additional block of like EQ, which is probably desperately needed in this example. Probably something like that. And then I would go in here and I would bounce it. And then this could be working for me as my stock, which I could then obviously go in and, we'll do the additional stuff on. So you just have to look around for things. You can use all sorts of different sounds and all sorts of different samples. Howling wind works really well. Here's this detuned wind turbine. This one might be a little bit more pitched, so we'll have to look at it inside of the span. Yeah, you could argue this is a little bit more pitched. So what you might want to do from the very beginning is go in here, put into stretch mode. And then if this was playing back with your song, this isn't so much about using the span to find something as it is just changing the pitch until you hear it kind of lock in or sound good to you. That's really, I think, the best way to do it. If you get too caught up with the display, oftentimes the display kind of lies to you, and using your ear is always the way to go. So sometimes even just if it appears to be completely out of tune, it may work out quite well there for you. And also it is worth going back in here and I think changing the slope so that we're not really being tricked by the low end. So here, if we wanted to get this down to C, and if we were using that as our guide, we could just take this down a little bit. And that would probably be good enough. You'd have to have a song playing in C to actually know. But again, this is really more about you just going outside of your comfort zone to find things that can work as sweep effects. Even just very heavy blocks of things like a lot of different waveforms can work out really well. Or you could even layer this with the waterfall, for example. Something like that, we could group it together and then go in here and say, okay, let's just take this portion here and bounce it. And then we'd have our block there that we could work with. So very easy, very simple. And it's just about being willing to experiment, I think, more than anything else. Find those things. Radio static works great. Tape hiss can work extremely well. So if you have any of those like Waves plugins that give you the tape noise or whatever, you can isolate that, really boost it way, way, way up, and use that as the starting point for your sweep. Sometimes that works really good. I don't know why. It just happens to be one of those things that starts great as a little block of sound. So go out there, find some samples, wind, rain, natural sounding things, leaves rustling, or even here something that's a little bit more unnatural, like this wind turbine that's been detuned, certainly could work great as the starting block of marble for some kind of sweep effect. And last, but certainly not least, we have the synthesizer option for creating our block of noise, which will then be used for sweeps. This is probably, in a lot of ways, the most popular option that does get used because so many synthesizers have a built-in noise generator, some with more options than others. But the ability to also add in or mix in a little bit of a waveform can go quite a long way. So let's imagine that we want to create here a 4-bar sweep, okay? At least the block for it. So let's imagine that our song is in C. I'll bring this up to like C4 for now. And let's just get started with this. So in this synthesizer, and we'll look at this in a couple of different options here, we can take the noise and bring this up to 100%. Now we have white noise. There's some filter motion on that now that I want to get rid of. So I'll just take off that envelope. I'll open the filter all the way up, and I'll just change here the amplitude envelope to be the standard gate. So we now just have our block of noise. And if we were to bounce this, we would just see that this is white noise. So basically like what we were able to start with from Audacity. So if you can do an Audacity, you can also do it in any synthesizers that give you a noise option. And remember, the added benefit is if we needed this to be 8 bars instead, we could drag this out and we could get 8 bars. So there's no limit, and it's very easy then to click in the exact amount of time that you need. So that's one of those added benefits. But what I really like about this is that we can even blend in maybe a little bit of a waveform to, at least anticipate pitch or to suggest pitch. So if I take the noise, I bring it down to like 95, we'll now hear some of that waveform, or a lot of it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to experiment with the different shape options and things. Try to find something that I like, and I could just go and modulate some of these controls just to give you a little bit of something else. And this is really where the fun kind of comes into this, is that it's about doing things that are a little bit more unique to you, and just something as simple as this is going to make it quite unique. So something like this is also even anticipating the fact that there will be a sweep motion. I don't want to create the entire sweep now, but I want to create something that might even anticipate it. So sometimes this oscillator FM really does the trick. In this example, it's not doing much of anything, so I'm not going to use it. You could even go and change the pitch on this. That definitely would be emphasizing or making it sound like there's going to be a sweep, but we can do that after the fact as well. And then once I was ready with this, I could just go and I could bounce it out. And so here's my block. And you may not think that that little synth noise is going to make a big difference, but it really does as compared to just working with straight white noise. So you need to go in with your own synthesizers that you have and kind of look at this, but I can show you a couple of other examples as well, just quickly here. Here's a free synthesizer that we looked at in the second course, the 102 course. And let's stretch this all the way out to go for 4 bars. Bring it up. And here we have a mixer control. So by default, I'll just start by bringing the noise all the way up. And let's mute this other guy. There we go. Okay. So there we have our noise yet again. Let's go ahead and just get this envelope to be like the other one. And then up here under miscellaneous, we do have a control over the color of this noise. If we want something a bit darker, we can mess with that. We can also even mess with the cutoff and the resonance to get us different colors. So a lot of times I like doing something like that, and then we can bring in a little bit of an oscillator if we want. Let's actually use oscillator 2 since I can tune that one up. You can also work with the feedback sometimes. That makes it pretty extreme, but this wouldn't be too bad of a starting place. And then if I wanted, I could go and I could use some of the chorus. And this is part of the fun, is taking the built-in effects that you have and having them be a part of the block. And again, we could go and we could modulate something, especially like the feedback control would be a very good idea. So that would definitely be anticipating something like a sweep effect. And as you were to use other effects in the chain after you bounce out this block, it's going to really actually add a whole nother element to that effect that you have. So we can listen here first to the polysynth one. And then to what we did in the Tyrell N6. So very different qualities there. It's not like every single block that you work with is the same. And that's especially true then when you get into some of these paid plugins that give you a lot of different options. So if we bring this down here and take a look at Serum, it's a little bit harder to necessarily know where to go to set this up, but it's pretty simple. So right now we should just hear this oscillator. But we can go and we can turn on the noise, turn off the oscillator, bring the level of this all the way up. And we have the noise like so. We could go back, do our classic little oscillator trick there. But what's really nice about this plugin is that there are so many different options that we can choose from when it comes to picking noise that we want. So we could use like an air can. And then supposedly you can actually key track this by turning this guy on. But it doesn't always seem to correspond with the note that you're playing necessarily. So there's still an additional pitch control. And you can hear how this can actually very easily be used as a sweep effect in and of itself. Sorry, I forgot I gotta like go all the way from the beginning there. So there's your sweep, done. So, it's very easy in this program, and you have a lot of different effects to use. But we're, of course, trying to just create a block here. So we'll just use this air canister as is, and then go in and just add something like this guy. And then we'll go and we'll bounce this. And so here's what we have with the serum. Okay, so very easy, definitely worth experimenting with the synthesizers that you have, finding that noise generator, making that the loudest thing, and then if you want, bringing in a little bit of some kind of waveform just so that you can suggest pitch. Now that we've spent a pretty sufficient amount of time getting our block of noise, we can talk about the second and final step, which is sculpting the marble or chiseling away to create that final sweep. And so it's kind of funny that step 1, step 2, they're very broad steps, but they're very easy to accomplish. If you want a generic sweep, you can get that done in under 2 minutes. If you want something a little bit more unique and creative, you can spend 2 hours. That sort of gives you an idea at the variation and even just the amount of time that can be required, or you don't need to spend a lot of time. So it's kind of up to you and whatever's going to fit the track that you're working on. So you're going to be using filters for the most part and even other effects to ultimately create the sweeping effect, that final bit of motion at the end, creating all of that tension. If you want to make your life a bit easier, you can create some kind of effects chain. If you have macros, even better, which will then just give you a variety of effects that you can always use for this purpose of sculpting and creating your sweeps. You can add in rises or falls of pitch. You can chop it up so you can have some drastic volume alterations happening, just using your basic slice tool from your DAW. You can use sidechain gating. You could use sidechain compression. You can use what are called like audio modulators, where it follows an envelope followers, and then dictates some other kind of change. We'll look at that, of course, in the example. You can mess with pan. And then, of course, the biggie at the bottom here is you do have to use automation to ultimately get that final sweep effect. And we'll be looking at, again, a number of different applications of this inside of the DAW. So there are literally a million things you can do. And what you're really going for if you're working from scratch is finding a way to make your sweep relate or just basically work in the context of the track that you have going. So that's what you need to keep in the back of your mind. That's the thing I can't really teach you. That's the why element to all of this, is that you're trying to make something that actually has some semblance of just similarity to the track that you're working on. That's the kicker. That's the key. That's why you do this from scratch and you don't work with just, the pre-built samples. Sometimes you find a ready-made sample and it fits better than anything you can make on your own. If that's the case, use it. But if you don't have access to it or you don't want to spend the 15, 20 minutes of searching something out, you can always go in and try to mock something up from scratch. So we'll jump back into the DAW and just look at a couple examples of things that might just, jog your own brain, jog your creativity so that you can jump in and do some really wild stuff on your own. The word sweep actually tells us quite a bit about this effect. The word really describes what we're going to be doing. When I think of the word sweep, I think of the word motion. And when I think of the word motion, I actually think about music in general, but specifically to electronic music or working in the DAW, when you think motion, you should always be thinking automation, because that's what really does it for us here in this software domain. So there's not going to be a whole lot to go over in this section. We spent a lot of time talking about different blocks of noise that you could start with, but really here it's a complete playground. There are no rules. Think back to everything you've learned about with effects processing on this website, and it can all be applied. So the classic sweep involves the filter, and one thing you'll notice is that with this bounce here, we have this excess little ringing on the end. We don't need that at all. We can just get rid of it. So this is really cool about the bounce, is you can always lock it in to exactly what you want. So we have this little 8-bar here, and the classic sweep effect is, of course, the filter. So I'll just go in here and I'll grab a filter. It could be either something analog modeled or just, generic. And we'll bring it in here, close it down for now so that nothing is happening. And then we'll just go in here and automate this cutoff frequency. So let's just focus here more towards the end. We'll have it sweep up under these 2 bars. We'll have it go all the way. And if we want to emphasize that, we can also bring in some resonance. So I'm just going to also automate in the resonance here. Something like that. So that in and of itself is basically the sweep effect that we're going for. But it doesn't just have to be done with filters. You can also use pitch, or you can do some kind of a combination of the two. So in this case, we'll have the pitch first drop, and we'll just do this in octaves to make it easy. So let's just take a listen to this. We have that filter coming up. And I think here for this very last little half bar, we'll use it and have it come really rising up quite a bit. And that would be a totally fine and usable sweep effect. But you can always go in and, set this more to taste. If you need to, you can do volume automation. And in this example, it might make sense to do that. And if we wanted to, we could even emphasize things a little bit more all the way towards the end. So I'll actually just take this volume and just rise it all the way here, like so. We can add a little bit of a curve into this. And the other thing I do like to check out and do with something as basic as this would be to quickly take a look at the span and just see if there is a lot of low-end information that we should be getting rid of. And this is pretty good. Still might be a good idea, though, to high pass that ever so slightly. So something like this. Okay, so that would be the very basic classic style sweep effect, and you can do that with basically any block of noise that you have, and obviously then go in and get a little bit more experimental. But there's still more fun to be had here and things that are routinely done. Remember that we want this to always be set up in context with our song. This is the reason why we're doing it. Otherwise, we could just use a standard preset. But even if you use a standard preset, you can go in there and you can set that and get it to taste. But some other effects that work really well are things like flangers. And again, we're going to want to do some automation here. So I might go in here and just take this mix control, and also maybe this time we'll start with it up. Then have it rise again. Increase the rate on this modulation. And then increase the amount. Let's get more rate than that. Yeah, we could still even do more. Let's have it go all the way. Perfect. And this is sort of an effect that you hear a lot, sort of like the bubbling effect. That's what it's called. And you could use different things too. Phasers work particularly well in this context. And we're also getting a little bit of stereo width, which is something that is usually desperately required for sounds like this. You can go in and you can do things like modulating the pan, or in this case, let's use the rotary effect. That one's a little bit more fun. I'm going to actually put it in an FX chain, since by default in this program, it does not give me a dry wet control. So I'll put that again. And notice how I'm putting most of these things before the filter, with the exception of this EQ, which is really serving more of just a mixing purpose. So we'll go in and we'll grab the rotary here. Put it in like so, bring that mix down. Yeah, something like that's pretty cool. And then we'll just set up the mix like that. So we'll have it start out like this with a very slow rate, and then slowly start to come up. So you can hear how that's panning around there. Almost has like a horn effect from the distance. And one thing I do strongly recommend is that you try out different filter shapes. So if you have something that's a little bit more in line with an analog filter, you'll get maybe a variety of low pass options or whatever. So my recommendation here is just go in and spend quite a bit of time experimenting. Try every single effect. Something like a bit distortion would work really well, especially at the end. We can emphasize things a bit, or using like a comb filter. This could be very interesting if we want a little bit more pitch ringing out. So let's actually set this to something that's like, I forget what we set this to, if it was a C or an A. Doesn't matter that much, but we'll just go up here and kind of find the A. Okay. That's pretty cool, especially if we actually drop that frequency in real time. This should be interesting because the pitch is going up, but this comb filter is dropping. Oh yeah, that's definitely cool. All right, so also in terms of just housework, and I know I'm just kind of going through this in real time because you guys already know so many things that you can experiment with. The main point of this section of the video is just showing you the sweeping motion with either the filter, which we did here, or with pitch, which you can also do. And you can make these things more drastic too. It doesn't have to be going on a nice curve. You could actually jump this up, for example, or actually jumping it down would probably make more sense, like this. Sometimes this works well, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, that's what I wanted. So let's try something like this. Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different things you can experiment with. We could go in here and we could like chop this up as well. I'm a little hesitant to do that in this video because I don't think I'm going to get something that sounds very good. But you could go and like chop a couple of just areas out of this. I'm just chopping out a couple of 16th notes here. And we'll just delete a couple of these guys. And you can do much more fun and interesting rhythmic things. Let's put it to 32nd note here and go in and just chop this out a little. All right. Do a little bit of that, a little bit of this. And now we're going to get something really wild that may not sound good. Yeah, so that was a little bit weird, but, you know, whatever. This is why you shouldn't do these things in video tutorials, but actually do them in your real time. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is that we can use some techniques and things that we've looked at before. Specifically, things like delay throws come in very handy here. So I'm just going to set up a quick little delay 2 here. We'll go with 3 and 6 full-blown width here. And let's just check this out real quick when it's going the whole time. And so right now you can hear that we're getting a lot of that, but let's say we only really want that heavy filter motion. We can use the throw technique to kind of get that more in line with what we want. So I'll take a little bit here just to kind of let people know that it's coming. And then we'll do the throw more so at the end here when we get that big amount of movement happening. So let's test this out and hear what it sounds like. Very, very cool. And then we could go in here and, of course, process this delay throw separately. And this is all part of the game here. So we'll take a little bit of reverb. And then I'd probably also EQ this differently. So I think the main idea to take away from this little lab session is that you can do anything. You can use your other plugins that you have as well. So it doesn't just have to be, of course, the stuff that comes built in, but I recommend spending a lot of time with these different ideas, trying some things out, seeing what works, what doesn't work. You'll eventually realize there are some effects that you particularly like in conjunction with a sweep, and some things that you maybe don't like as much. Like, let's use the chorus here on this delay. That should be pretty cool. And then if we don't want something as extreme, we all know that we could maybe go in and do a little number like this. That's very cool. And don't forget that the motion with the filter doesn't just have to be one way. It could actually be something along these lines too. This works really well with a lot of resonance. Even more extreme. And then what would work even better is to have some kind of distortion happening after that to emphasize this motion even more. So I'm going to grab the bit 8 to do that. I'm trying to decide if I want it before or after the filter. I'm going to go after the filter. So you can kind of hear what I'm anticipating. Now the resonance is going to be too crazy. See if I can get this to sound right. That's a little bit better. Cool, I like that. And then I might need to bring the gain down just a little bit to save it. And then don't forget that you can do things at the beginning too that aren't going to necessarily be related to what's happening at the end. So if I want to do something really interesting, I might use like a frequency shifter and a resonator bank in combination and have those actually fade out as the main effect for the sweep is fading in. So let's try that out by grabbing a resonator bank. I'm just going to use one of these presets that are in here. Some of these are pretty cool. Let's see. And then I'm also going to grab a frequency shifter. I'll combine them into a chain. Okay, so this is going to be really fun and interesting. So I'm going to start by having this way up and then slowly fade it out. Still don't feel like I'm getting quite the motion on the filter that I want, but that's okay. You know, can't have everything. See if doing it this way would help. There we go. Part of the problem is I may have actually taken too much of the low end out. Aha, there it is. Okay, so as it's just a lot of tweaking, as you can see, I don't normally like doing videos in this fashion, but with something like the sweep, I think it can be worthwhile seeing somebody just kind of experimenting with it a little bit, because that's what you're going to be doing. So once you get that initial setup with the filter and your block of noise, or in some cases of pitch, you then need to just go in and take this even further. And again, I would probably take something like a tool device at the very end and just emphasize more what's happening in those stereo channels. Because a lot of times that's what you want with the sweeps. You want to keep the main elements of the track pretty much firmly rooted where they are, and then have something like the sweep appearing to be a bit wider. That works well, but it can also work well in inverse. We could put this down into mono too. And then you get that very wide delay effect happening on the end. So sky's the limit here. It literally is. And this is a case where I really hope that you go and maybe make a few on your own and post up the results that you got, because I think everybody loves sweep effects. This is one of the few times in music production where you really can just throw it all at the wall, even if you're trying to make something, say, for Beatport Top 100, or even if you're making like a pop song, you can get away with doing some experimental stuff here because the listener likes these moments. It's all about energy, building that up, taking it away. How are you transitioning? And next week, we'll actually be looking at ways to do this with parts that you already have in the track, so reusing them as a way to make sweeps and builds. Here, we're doing it completely from scratch, and that is just as viable of an option. I just wanted to really quickly mention, if you really do hate working with samples, or you really are just not fond of bouncing things and exporting those blocks of noise, you can keep it entirely within a synthesizer. Do I recommend it? Well, maybe in some cases, because let's imagine that you've been using this synthesizer throughout the track and you want to use the same filters that you have on all the other sounds, in which case, yeah, keeping things inside of the synth, at least for a lot of the time, might make more sense. So if we go in here and we just add in some element of noise here, let's just check this out, make sure that we've got it where we want it. Cool. So if we start out with something like that, we can keep it pretty much built into the synthesizer, and we can either use a filter from here and send the noise through it, or I do believe we have the filter in the effects section, which I'm going to go into the effects section because this just makes a little bit more sense. Don't forget that you can also still use your regular built-in effects. I just want to show you how you can keep things within the synth if you'd prefer to do that. We heard how good the pitch sounded before when we did that, so maybe we'll do the same kind of thing here. And let's just make this a 2-bar sweep just to make life easier for ourselves. Actually sounds good, just that little bit. Something like that. Cool, so I like that starting place. I also hear that there's a lot of low end built into this one, so I am going to take care of that at the beginning, just kind of good habits. Very nice, I like that. And we'll go into the effects section here. We'll add in one of these filters, and the mix is all the way to 100%. So now it's just a matter of grabbing the cutoff. You can hear part of the problem here is then having to get these sort of settings to be absolutely perfect. Okay, that's a little bit better. And I have all sorts of different filter options, so I can go with something a little bit steeper. And then using something like a phaser. So something like that would definitely work. I've obviously done this in just really fast, quick time, and you could take this a lot further, make it a lot better, but there you have it. You can stick within the synth if you want, and then once you finish, you can always take it, and you can bounce it out, and you can get rid of the instrument like so, and then we should just have our sweep effect. And then we can do even a little bit more work inside of here. We might want to use some sort of a dynamics device. So there you go. You can keep it in a synth if you want, do some stuff in there first. It's really up to you, just a matter of personal taste. And again, trying to keep everything in context with the song you're making. So again, if you have used, say, the same synthesizer for 5 or 6 different parts, it might make sense to continue to use some of those same filters just to keep that basis of familiarity, not only for yourself, but also even perhaps for the listener on more of a subconscious level. On now to final thoughts. This is simply one technique for creating a transition effect, for adding that bit of tension into your composition. There are a lot of other things you can do. This is just one of them. Next week, we'll be looking at another technique and something that is used probably just as commonly as starting with the block of noise. We're actually going to do something else. I'm not going to spoil it for you now. Some of you may have an idea already. This is one of those techniques, like so many, that requires a lot of experimentation, a lot of patience, and a lot of practice. I can't show you a one-size-fits-all method. It really comes down to the track you're working on and you just coming up with some ideas and then seeing how they end up working out in context of the track. So always be thinking in terms of the song context and also of the song's energy, tension, and release. This comes down to a lot with the arrangement of your song. Are you building to then that energetic drop? Or are you actually building up and then having a breakdown instead where a lot of elements go away? So these are things that you need to consider before you even go in and start adding these sweeps, because the way that you craft the sweep may be related to what's happening in the arrangement. And if you do this, you should be able to make appropriate sweeps that suit the actual song that you're making, which is what this is all about and why you would be making custom from scratch sweeps in the first place. Thanks a lot. Hope you've learned something new.